The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
All right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Stephen Krutzfeldt, and I will be your webinar leader today, taking you through this presentation. I'm a pre-sales engineer with CDI, been here the last 2 years, and I look forward to doing 2 of these a month. Today's webinar is going to be around Laserfiche Directory Server, or what's more commonly referred to as LFDS. It's a more obscure topic, something that pretty much all of our clients are using now, but there's not a lot of content around it, not a lot out there. So I thought that I'd take this opportunity to go through and take you through a tour of what LFDS is, how we came about it, some of the tips and tricks to using it, and maybe shed some light on some of the different capabilities that you may not be aware of, and hopefully you can take something away from it. If this is your first build along, what is a build along? It's designed to be an interactive experience meant to guide the viewer through the creation and deployment of a common business process. Now today, the main takeaway will be to, at the highest level, learn how to add a user in LFDS and license them. So license management will be the key today. Any questions you have, please post them in the questions box. I'll take some time at the end of the webinar to go through those and answer as many as I can. If I can't answer it, I'll certainly take some notes down and follow up with you. Tips for success. As always, take good notes. I personally like to take a lot of screenshots. Don't be afraid to ask questions. Chances are if you have a question, someone else on the call does as well. Please complete the survey afterwards. I do look at those, and I'm always hoping that there are recommendations on how I can conduct these better, make them more exciting, more informative. Also, topics are a big one too, that as we round out the year, I'm going to be putting together a new sort of curriculum, and any topics that you guys would like to hear, please share those with us, and then we'll try and work them in. And this will be recorded. Individual sessions are available as well, but this should be on our YouTube channel hopefully by the end of the week. So today's process, using LFDS, Laserfiche Directory Server. The intended audience for this is going to be Laserfiche admins and advanced users that, because it is license management, it's usually locked down pretty tight and only administrators will have access to it. But for those of you who are interested in how the licenses are set out and how people are getting access to Laserfiche and the different Laserfiche applications like workflow and forms, this should give you a little bit better idea of how all that happens and what's going on in the back end. If you're following along at home, then you will need access to LFDS, obviously. We also may take a look at the Laserfiche client and the admin console as well. Overall, they kind of all tie in together. The Laserfiche Directory Server, LFDS, is where we're going to be licensing. But as far as actually giving the users access to the repository and things, that's all done in the admin console. A lot of times when we're setting up users, it gets a little bit fuzzy with folks that are like, okay, I licensed my user, but how come they don't have access yet? Well, there's one more step in the admin console, so we'll try and go through that as well. To help you follow along, we're going to begin by doing an introduction to LFDS. We're then going to go through a tour and see what the LFDS user interface is like and where some of those different activities are at. And then we'll finish by licensing a user and giving them access to the repository. So first off, what is LFDS? Well, as I've alluded to already, LFDS is a web-based license management application. Now, I highlighted web-based because the older license management system was done more so just kind of on-premise, had an older look and feel to it. A lot of people, I found it more cumbersome, a little bit confusing, not nearly as intuitive. But the new UI is much more intuitive, and it's a lot easier to go through different processes. Plus, it's super helpful to have everything in one place. It was introduced in version 9.2 for Rio. As I mentioned, it has an intuitive web interface. This is a snapshot of just the main page. You'll see this in more detail as I go through it. But it's meant to be a comprehensive license management from a single location. Usually when we talk about license management, we really think just about licensing our different applications that can be installed, multiple instances. as well as the overarching all-encompassing license as well. So what does it do? Well, it creates Laserfiche users, as well as adding directory users and granting user licenses. It gives you the ability to configure activity directory synchronization also, so that way you can automatically update your named user list if you're using SAML or Windows AD accounts. Also allows you to register the named devices, that if you have device licenses, oftentimes we see this as like a scanning station or a workstation. We can license the different Laserfiche applications for that device, and that can also be managed in the same place. And then it's also easy to review the application registrations, allocate new application licenses as well. One of the things that's new with LFDS is the ability to allocate your licenses by organization. So you're going to have your users and you're going to have your groups, but we also have organizations added here too. Organizations are typically meant to be, I think of them as, if you're an accountant or if you're in accounting, those different org buckets where you're budgeting a certain number of users or a certain amount of money. So with organizations, you can actually sort the licenses into those buckets. So the examples we see here are AP and AR. We can see that AR has 7 full licenses that have been allocated to their departments. So then as you begin to license these out, you can see that AR has used all theirs, but AP has some of their licenses. But it gives you a little bit more control over how you're budgeting and billing out those licenses. So license allocation, and then also each one of these organizations can have their own separate administrators as well. So each department has a Laserfiche admin who's managing those licenses. So the other question is, where is it? How do I access LFDS? Well, LFDS is typically installed on the Laserfiche server, the overarching server that's kind of at the top of everything else. This would be the star on your Christmas tree of servers, if you will. Sorry, I just pulled that out. I was just, that just sounded a little funny, but yeah, I like it. No, okay, the star on the Christmas tree, sure. But if you're on the Laserfiche server, you'll be able to access that from the start menu. It'll just be called Laserfiche Directory Server or LFDS. We oftentimes also, when we're going through the installation, like to add a desktop shortcut on desktop as well. It's just a little bit easier to find. But the most common place where I usually access it is the web URL, because it is a web-based application. You would simply navigate to https:// the machine name, server name, and then / LFDS. So with that, if you've been to a few of these, you know that I'm not a fan of PowerPoint when I can go through and actually demo it. So let's go ahead and just take a look at LFDS. Now I'm on our demo machine, so picture this as your own Laserfiche server that we're remoted into. We see we have the desktop shortcut right here. Also, if you go into the start menu, that would be under Laserfiche. And let's see if we can find it. Yeah, directory server right there. So that's what that would look like. So you could always create a shortcut from that. Also, we're using Internet Explorer for whatever it is now, 30 more days before they sunset it. And it's taken us to https://localhost LFDS. But this is the landing page, and so this is what it looks like. As you can see, it's got that nice clean UI that we like to see. And at the very top, on the very first overview tab here, we've got a couple different tabs that we'll go through. The overview tab is going to show us, give us a snapshot of how many licenses we've paid for and how many are used and how many are still available. So we have a couple of participant licenses, and we have a couple of community licenses, and a couple of full licenses. It looks like we haven't allocated any of our participants or any of our community. There's still 10 of 10 available. Also, we have that date of how long they're valid until we need to renew that licensing. It looks like we've used all but 3 of our full licenses here. Also, if you go down here, it'll give you an idea of the different applications. So how many registered instances we have and how many we have left, like how many have actually been used. and also where those are located. So we've got a couple of different, these are actually server locations. So on the server side, we can see those different servers right here. We just named them as is. But we can actually go through and see which of those servers have the registered instances on them, and vice versa on the application, where is it actually installed. So super helpful for maybe your IT group, but not necessarily anything that the average user would necessarily need to know. However, if someone asks, where would I find that out? You can say, oh, have you checked LFDS? Probably more helpful is going to be the different accounts. This is where I spend most of my time just as a consultant, as someone who's setting things up. I'm not usually on the support side. I don't usually do a lot of the installations or anything like that, but I do help with adding different users and groups. So this is where a lot of that's going to be handled. So LFDS accounts tab. So here we can see that we have a couple different users and they have different colored dots next to them, and that has to do with the user type. Yeah, let's stick with this quick. So if we wanted to add a new user, we'll go through this in complete detail in a second, but if we open this up, we'll see that we can add a new user as a named Laserfiche user. So this would be someone who you would set up an actual username and password for the Laserfiche repository, but they wouldn't necessarily be tied back to any other sort of AD account or SAML account or anything like that. Oftentimes our forms, our workflow users are just named Laserfiche accounts, service accounts that log in with the username and password that we use. So that means that anyone who wanted to go in and use that username and password could do it. More commonly, however, we have the Windows Active Directory users, that if your Laserfiche account server is tied to your Windows domain, you can start querying your different Windows accounts as well as your Windows AD groups and register them easily in LFDS. So if we did want to add someone who's a registered user, or more commonly, if we wanted to bring in everyone who's in a specific group, we could go into groups, add a new group, query the Windows AD group and bring everyone in at once, and then assign the licenses as such. Similarly, as you probably saw, we also have LDAP, which isn't quite as common, but also SAML users as well, if you want to set up a SAML site. Organizations, as I mentioned, is something that's relatively new, that if you want to allocate and budget the number of users and licenses to the different departments or different financial entities in your organization, you can do that here by setting up those organizations. So that when you create a new user, you can say which organization they belong to, and that'll knock one of the licenses off. Similarly, we have groups. So a couple of groups that we have examples of here are just forms. If we look at the details here, we can see who belongs to that group, so who's going to have access to forms, for example, and then we can keep track of those a little bit easier. So the organization is just, root is the default. So if you see root, it just means that they don't necessarily belong to an organization, or I guess another way to look at that would be they belong to kind of all the organizations. We also do give you the ability to add a supervisor in here as well. So if you want to know who the admin is or who the supervisor is, main point of contact for that group, you can add that information in here as well. And we will look at this in a little bit more detail at the end when we go through and add a new user. We don't have any devices, but if you were to register a device, like a workstation, you could do that from here as well. On the Applications tab, we can see a list of all the different Laserfiche applications that are available and how many instances of them have been installed. So as you can see here, we have pretty much the full suite. You may not necessarily have all of these in yours, depending on which package you bought. But on the right-hand side here, we can see these numbers, and that's how many instances have been installed on each one of these. So for example, Laserfiche Connector, we only have one instance installed. There's some basic information here. We can also see any legacy licenses carried over, and then all the different machines that we're using as well. There's some basic settings, and these are mainly site settings. So if anytime you want to renew your master license or renew the subscription master license, if you want to have that happen automatically, you can turn that on here. Oftentimes we see this is really helpful if we begin to add users or grab a new license for a new application. And so we want to update the master license. That can be done right here from the General tab. You can see the licensing site. This will be, once this is attached, it's very easy to manage. Detaching and changing is all going to be done from LFDS as well, so be aware of that. If you do want notifications to come out, so let's say that if you're like me and you're a little bit worried about when that license is going to expire, you want some heads up so that way you can get everything in order ahead of time and make sure it gets renewed smoothly. We can send out email notifications. I can tell you that ours happens sometime in April, and it only happens on days that there's either a webinar or something really important that you don't want anything to happen, because that's exactly when the license expires and needs to go through renewal. Now I have it on my calendar, so I'm well aware it won't happen again. But it is a pain, so it's good to kind of have those notifications turned on. AD synchronization, so if you are tied to a Windows AD domain, then you can go ahead and have that synchronize automatically every number of hours or every day, what have you. So that way, as you're adding Windows AD accounts, it's easy to tie those back and link Laserfiche licenses also. We do have the ability to manage multi-factor authentication if that's important to you. You can talk to our support team about that if that's something you want to enable. Oftentimes, though, it's kind of moot because chances are you're going to be on a domain. There's probably a VPN involved already, so I wouldn't imagine that multi-factor authentication would be necessary for Laserfiche, but just know that it's out there. Also SAML, if you want to set up a SAML login configuration, just point out the landing page and the entity ID, and we have that capability as well, as we saw. If we are sending out automatic emails, you'll need to register an SMTP site or email server, and you can have the template here as well. That's going to be used for the notifications and then also for password resets and things like that. Password is, this is actually going to be the passwords more so specifically for Laserfiche Directory Server. Sorry, so for passwords for each of the users, do we want the users to change their passwords on a periodic basis? If so, we can set that here. Enforced password history, I believe, has something to do with keeping track of the older passwords and are they different enough? I would need to double check that though. Also, complexity is something that you can manage as well. As you know, best practice is always to have a higher complexity. I think most of the IT groups that I've sat in on have recommended using phrases rather than passwords, like passphrases essentially. And as many numbers, letters, uppercase, lowercase, special characters as possible. So minimum number of character sets, password length, etc. And then also, do you want to enable account lockout? I don't necessarily recommend account lockout ever because I've seen it backfire more often than not. However, this would also come down to the standards and practices within your organization if that's something that you want to enable. If you are locked out, an admin would be able to come in and, of course, let you back in. But it is something that can, yes, everything will be more secure, but it can cause more problems. I will say it's not necessarily best practice to enable account lockouts. Security is kind of the ability to add a user and make them a user within LFDS. So are they allowed to detach anything? Are they allowed to register identity providers or master licenses? Can they view, or are they just view only? So think of this as setting up the user security for LFDS is where you would set that all up. Identity providers, this is going to be where you would set up either your SAML sites or Windows AD. You'll just need some basic information about, in this case, this is a SAML site, so name, type, host, who's the issuer, where's the endpoint, binding type. If there's a certificate, we'll need that, thumbprint, etc. And if it's Windows, then we can see a Windows authentication is enabled using the service account to query it. So obviously this will need to be turned on. It'll need to be linked so that way that when you're in here, you can actually query the AD accounts to tie them back. But the identity providers is where you would set all that up and tie it together. Once this is in place, then you can start adding the accounts from either the SAML site or from Windows AD. Same here, if you want to set up the security token services, that's where you would add those. So in this case, we have our SAML endpoint and identity provider discovery endpoint. And we haven't really done much with self-registration. The last tab I'll talk about here is going to be the audit report, that if you want to keep an eye on or run a report to see what's been done in LFDS, you can generate these reports pretty quickly. So in this case, I could just say, I want to look at today, and I want to look at a specific, maybe user principal only. Hit search, that'll actually generate a snapshot and generate a report so I can see what we've done. You know, do we delete users? Do we add users? Who's the username? It's showing you the SID as well for that user. But these reports can be generated ad hoc and then shared however. On the audit configuration, this is where you can tell it kind of what to track, what different audit activities or what activities will be audited. Will be at the user side, by group, by device, by organization. You've got a lot of different options here, each one with little sub options. So the group, do you want to audit every time a group is created, every time a group has a name updated, every time a group's deleted? By default, I just click all of these. I think that I never know what I'm going to need to check on an audit report, and it's really not taking up too much of the CPU or anything like that to go through and keep a track of all these different audit trails. So I would just say, best practice, track it all. Ours is set right now to keep the records in the audit for 90 days. That may be overkill, or it may not be enough, depending on kind of what it is you're looking for. I think 90 is kind of the standard. I don't really necessarily have a recommendation for how long that should be or shouldn't be. I would say that 30 would be the minimum though, at least go back 30 days. 90 is probably a pretty happy middle ground though. And also you can say perform data maintenance at a certain time, so that way you're not missing anything. This would usually be done at off hours. Ours is happening at 2 a.m. All right. You can also generate a usage report. That was the other thing I was going to show you. So if we go into back to the overview account, if you hit the settings, that literally will just take you to the settings tab. But if you want to generate a usage report, that can be done. And it's just a CSV at this point. All right, now let's go ahead and get into how would we license a new user. This is the most common and something that I really want to walk through it. I feel like most of the people who are visiting YouTube are going to skip to this amount. So I feel like I need one of those little clippers like, okay, action. So visiting LFDS at localhost LFDS, we're going to go to accounts and we're going to add a new user. And just show you how both ways you can do this. Most commonly, you're probably going to be going through and adding a Windows AD account, but we'll go ahead and also add just a regular Laserfiche named account as well. Once you bring this on, you can say which organization it's going to belong to. Remember, that'll take a license away from the budgeted number of licenses for that organization. Also, if they're going to belong to a group, that can help when actually setting up the security as well if you add them to a group. We'll then click on Registered Directory Users, and it's looking at the different identity providers here. The Rio demo one is the one that we have. It's the only Windows AD account we have tied here. Remember, we had other identity providers for SAML sites also. But in this case, if we want to query Windows AD, we could say, I think there's an admin in there. Search for it. It'll go out into AD, find anything that looks like admin, and there we have it. So then we could just double click it, add it. That'll add it to the users. You can also add both. And then we would hit OK. It'll then ask you what kind of license you want to give it. Remember from our overview, we have 3 full licenses left, and then we have 10 each of both employee participants and community users. We'll say we want this person to be have a full license. Remember, full licenses have access to everything. They can save documents to Laserfiche. They can view them. They can make changes. They can add metadata. They pretty much have free reign of all the different folders, documents that you give them access to. Whereas the other 2 are both going to be read-only. Community users are going to have access to forms, though, and be able to generate forms and things like that. Generate forms, submit forms. So once we add that, we can hit Finish, and then that'll take out a license. That person will appear in our accounts as a new user. I just went ahead and hit Cancel because I'm not actually looking to add anything, but I will go in and show you the second piece of this. It would show you exactly what you see here. Name of the user, full license, and the organization. Now, if we're setting up Windows AD, then we don't have to necessarily do anything with passwords because they're just going to use their Windows password to get in. However, the other side of this coin is what if we add a Laserfiche user? Now it's asking for a lot more information because it doesn't have anything tied to. We still have the ability to add an organization and a group. We can give it a username. First name, last name, and then it'll automatically add a display name, email, department, and then we can add a password, or we can generate a password, and you have the option to select this, which I recommend. User must change password at next sign-in. So what that does then is once the person first logs in, well, first of all, they'll get an email letting them know that they've been added. It'll give them a link also, so they can follow that link to Laserfiche, and it'll prompt them to change their password at that time. So once again, full license, we can see how many we have available, etc. Once again, I'm going to go ahead and cancel this. So LFDS, in a nutshell, is the ability to manage your different licenses. It might as well be License Directory Server, right? But once you've added it here, there is another step before your users can have access to Laserfiche. So that's what I want to look at next. Just give this a second to open up. Should have a couple different repositories. Oh, that's frustrating. Just 1 second. So once we've licensed our user, they still aren't necessarily going to have access to the repository yet. All they've done is they've used up a license, but we still need to grant them access to Laserfiche. So that's where you go into the admin console, select your repository. In this case, we're going to use demo repo, and then users and groups. And you're going to have a couple different options here. So there's the LFDS accounts, or Laserfiche directory accounts. And there you can see the different directory accounts we've added. Repository users is going to be specifically those named Laserfiche users, the one with the orange circle by their name. And also if you have specifically a Windows AD account, this is where you would find that one. All of them are more or less the same. If you click on any one of them, you're going to see some basic information. What you really need to be focusing on, though, is the authentication. So if you trust this individual, that's basically the same thing as flipping that on switch. That by trusting them, you're allowing them access. So yes, you have a license, and yes, you can log into this repository. You can also set up inheritance if it's set at a group level. So if they belong to a group that has access to the repository, then it can inherit it from that group. I often recommend, though, just trusting. You can see which groups they belong to. You'll also be able to see the different rights. If you look at some of my other webinars, I go through security in a little bit more detail, just a little more granularly. At the highest level, though, I recommend not adding any rights necessarily at this level, because we like to assign rights at the group level. If you leave these blank, then they will just inherit it from the group. So the step that you need to do is go into that user. Let's look at this one, for example. Make sure that you've trusted them, and make sure they either belong to a group, or if they don't belong to a group, you'd want to make sure that you set all these different rights, because they need to at least be able to scan somewhere, import something, search, etc. So once that's done, then they will have access to this repository to log in however you gave them access. So if they're a Windows account, they'll have that ability to, like you saw me do earlier, select that use Windows authentication. So if you click that, it should just let me right in based on my Windows user that I'm logged in as. If not, then when I try and open it up, it'll prompt me for my username and password. The last piece here is going to be to actually assign different security. So you can right click at the top at the repository level, go down to access rights, and then you can add your new user. So if we wanted to use Cream, for example, or Cream CDI, we'd want to make sure that they have access to everything below that. Most of these folders then will be inheriting rights from whatever's above them. So setting at the top level and then waterfall down. But again, like I said, going through security and assigning security rights in detail is that's another lesson for another day. Or you can go back into our YouTube channel and view that. I think it was either last month or 2 months ago. They've kind of all run together with COVID, but there is information out there. And also anyone on our team at CDI, we'd be more than happy to help you go through, identify who needs access to which folders, and help you set all this up. But I hope that you have a little better understanding now of what LFDS is, what it does, what it's used for, how to access it, etc. At this point, go ahead and go through some resources here quick. If you have any questions, the best place, in my opinion, to find anything is Laserfiche Answers. It's like our giant Laserfiche user community. Any question you have, post it out there. 98% of the time, it's already been asked, and there's already an answer that's been flagged as the best answer, and so you can find it that quick. If not, ask it, and there's always someone monitoring that who can find the answer pretty quickly and get it to you. Also, a lot of information on the solution exchange, and a lot of different, a lot of information at the Laserfiche support site as well. Everything from white papers to videos to just articles about different things here. In fact, I think I even did another video earlier about some of the different resources that are out there, so that'd be another one to look at. One thing that isn't listed here is the CDI YouTube channel. That's a good resource. Lots of great videos out there, hosted by yours truly. With that, I'll go ahead and answer any questions you guys have. If you open up your little floating GoToWebinar window, there's a questions tab. If you drop that down, you can just pop it in there. not seeing any questions. Did I do well? Did I answer all your questions? A lot of you are probably just thinking like, wow, this is great and I'm never going to use this. I have a couple of users that show up as repository users but are not showing up in LFDS. Why would that be? In order to access, I mean, it's possible they're not licensed. I mean, I would have to see it. So I guess I would ask you this, Brandon. Are they able to access Laserfiche? Like, are they able to log in? And my follow-up question, interesting. It's possible that they belong to a group, and maybe there's a group license that somehow is taking that up, or I mean, you do have the ability to create users and not license them, but typically you would have limited capabilities. That's actually it's kind of a really good question. Okay, so Laserfiche users, yeah, so I mean, I guess one thing that I've done in the past is, for demo purposes, I'll create a Laserfiche named user, trust them, and log in. And then basically, since they're trusted and I allow access, it does give them access, but it technically takes a license. Now, why does it show up in LFDS? It's possible just the two weren't tied together, and I think that is something that you can do. But the license manager should be keeping track of those. I don't know. That's a really good question. I'm going to go ahead and follow up with that. I'm taking down your name. And I'm going to ask my team how that would be. Yeah, I'll go ahead and get back to you on that because I'm not sure. I know the best practice when creating users is obviously to license them first, set them up in LFDS, and then add them in the admin console. Although when I was first starting out, I did create different users in the admin console, and some of them would have access, even though they weren't licensed. However, I just assumed by adding that trust or allow access, it basically took a license. So it's possible that it's taking a license, but not necessarily passing the details over. Yeah. Okay, how about an easy question? Who's got easy questions? Well, if there's nothing else, then I will let you guys get back to your day. Brandon, I'll go ahead and put that question out to my group, and I will try and get an answer for you by the end of the day. As I mentioned, all this will be on YouTube, hopefully by the end of tomorrow. So feel free to go back, review, take screenshots, and if any questions come up after the fact, you can email me at steven.krutzfeldt@cdi, or actually at cdsdigital.com or at cdi.support. They'll probably work also. And with that, have a good rest of your week. Thanks again, and hopefully we'll see you all next month.